welcome to Relish Books. Today I'm talking about Jayber Crow, a novel by Wendell Berry. I love Wendell Berry as a poet, one of my absolute favorites. Farming a Handbook in particular, I cannot recommend enough. But I hadn't really read much of his fiction. He has a lot of fiction titles as well as essays, and I would eventually love to read all of his work. But in particular right now, I would like to try to read all the Port William novels. And this one is not the first. I wanted to read them chronologically, but they're not necessarily, they're not plot-based stories. They're just stories, memories from Port William, from the people who lived there. And so I've heard that it doesn't really matter where you begin, and this is a good beginning. I mostly just picked it because at the time when I was checking them out, I didn't know what the first one technically was. But yeah, there's a bunch of them, and this one is, not the chronological first, but a good starting place. It didn't matter at all that I hadn't read any of the others. It's just about this man living in Port William, a bachelor barber who lived and barbered in Port William for some 40 years. And it's just his reflections on his life and on life in general, life in Port William in particular, life lived in nature by the river that runs through it in Port William. And it is a really beautiful novel. I love it when poets write fiction and when they write it well, because there's usually still a very poetic tone to it. There's a thoughtfulness to their words, to their language choices, to their descriptions that is particular to them that you won't find in, regular fiction maybe. So yeah, even though he's writing fiction, it still definitely feels very poetic. And along that line, it's a very, very slow-paced book. So even though I really liked it and would say it's definitely worth the read, it wasn't a quick, easy read. It was pretty difficult to get through for me, because you have to go slowly. You have to experience it slowly. It's not something you can just skim and get the full benefit of. It's a very thoughtful and slow-paced remembering. I think he actually even has another book called Remembering, but this one could be called that as well. It's very slow, but worth it. So it's slow, and it's also, it feels very sad. I don't know if sad's really the right word, but for lack of a better word, it feels sad. It feels sort of depressing because it's these recollections. I feel like books that are written in retrospect, that are written from memories, always have a little bit of a sad feeling because they're the past already. As you're experiencing them, as you're experiencing the stories for the first time, they're already somebody else's past. And so that's not my favorite way to read most books, but it's kind of the purpose of this one. And so it feels sad, it feels nostalgic, it feels really depressing in a way, as all of the characters are old and dying, and then all of his friends, he's losing them, one by one. Everyone that he's known and loved is dying, and there's this extra layer to it in that he is the town's barber, but he's also the church janitor, and he's also the grave digger. And so as the years go by, he ends up digging the graves for most of his friends. But it's not supposed to just be a downer of a book, even though he's talking about a way of life in a place that is, going to be gone, and a way of life that's dying, talking about these old farmers who are really being pushed out, after World War II in particular, and the Great Depression, and then industry moving in and everything changing, the highway coming through, and the farmers just, completely seeing their way of life that they've held for generations dying. So in that sense, it is very sad, but it's not meant to be just a sad book. He's looking back over his life and really appreciating it, appreciating the joys with the sorrows, and appreciating really a very simple life. And that's something that I think was profound about the book, in that he lived a life that was meaningful, even though from the outside it's not the kind of life that we might immediately think of as being that meaningful. He never went very far or did very much, became much of anything by worldly standards. He was a barber in this tiny little town for all these years. He never married, never had a family. The woman that he ends up loving for most of his life is he can never be with. She's married to someone else, married to a not very good person who gives her a very hard life. So for him, on the fringes, that's hard to watch. So he really has, in a lot of ways, from a different perspective, a very depressing life. But that's not the way that he chooses to see it in the end. He's really talking about learning to love life, learning to love the world, as in the people of the world and the natural world, the beauty of nature. He says, towards the end of the book, he says that it is a book about heaven, but it could almost have been a book about hell. And I think that that's a interesting perspective, and kind of a good way of looking at a difficult life, because it ultimately is about the attitude that you take and the perspective that you take and how you choose to react to things. Port William has been compared to like Lake Wobegon, and a couple other kind of similar things, and I can see some similarities, but overall, I think Port William has a much more serious tone. Lake Wobegon is largely humorous. There's a lot of serious moments and really heartwarming moments of Lake Wobegon stories, but mostly there's a focus on humor and lightheartedness, and there's definitely nostalgia. That's like the famous word used about Lake Wobegon, but Port William's much more serious, I think, much more thoughtful, supposed to make you think about the big life questions, so to speak. There's a lot of talk in the book about him exploring his religious beliefs. In his youth, he thought for a while that he was going to be a preacher, and then he rejected that and moved on. And the way that his faith kind of came back to him in later years, he explores those thoughts a lot. He explores kind of the way that he feels at odds with certain things in his beliefs. And I definitely think that, reading it, obviously seeing it in through my perspective, I feel like he is wrong about a lot of things, and yet his thought processes make sense. And so those were thought-provoking things as well. And I liked how, even though I think some of the conclusions that he comes to are very right and very profound, and some of the conclusions that he comes to are wrong, I like how he ultimately is like, you know what, this is what I thought after reading the Bible for all these years, but read it for yourself and see what you think. And I think that's a really good place to kind of leave it when you're thinking about all those things. It's just like, in order to come to form your own, in order to come to your own beliefs on things, you have to just read it for yourself. You can't just take what other people say about it, and that's what he chose to do, and that's what he ultimately encourages everyone else to do. So reading that, I was kind of like, I was being torn back and forth with his thoughts, but I really liked that he just left it there. Like, this is what I thought, you should read it for yourself. So I appreciated that. A couple of moments in the book that really stood out to me, apart from just the beauty of the writing, which is ultimately what I enjoyed, his thoughts about life and about nature were really great. A couple of moments in the story Again, it's not at all plot-based thing, so I feel like giving these moments away isn't really spoilers, but if you don't want to know, then you could just end the video now. But a couple really great moments, or really profound moments that I think are the ones that will stay with me, even though they're not necessarily maybe my favorite moments at all. They were just the most impactful, I guess. One was this moment where he's at a roadhouse, they call them. It's kind of like living the nightlife. He's there dancing with this woman who he has a very casual romantic relationship with. And he's there dancing. He's having a good time. And then he looks over and he sees the husband of this woman that he admires more than anyone else. He sees him there dancing with another woman, and realizes that he's being unfaithful. And they have this moment where, like, their eyes meet, and the other man kind of gives him this look of acknowledgement of, like, hey, like, isn't this fun type thing. And in that moment, he just feels, Jayber just feels this overwhelming horror. And his foremost horror isn't, that this man's there cheating on his wife. He's horrified by that. But his foremost feeling is that he's being acknowledged as an equal by this man. And he has to face, this man that he dislikes so strongly and he thinks is, not a good person. And he has this moment of realization of, like, oh, am I the same as him? Am I, the same kind of person that he is? And I don't know, just something about the way it was written, it felt very real. That kind of this sudden self-awareness moment, and it really caused him to change the course of the rest of his life. So I thought that was a really profound moment in the way that it was done. And then the other moment I think is going to stay in my mind just because it's the kind of scene from a book or a movie that stays in your mind is when the wife, Maddie, sees her daughter killed by a car when she's little. And I think I was thinking about it a lot, that scene. And I think as parents, a lot of parents say when there's a scene like that in a book or a movie where a child dies in front of a parent. And I've said this before, and I think other people say it a lot. We say, I can't imagine that. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, everyone says that, like, oh, I can't imagine what that would be like. And in this moment in the book, I realized, I was like, that's not true. When parents say, I can't imagine that, I don't think, for most people, I think that's not true. I think those scenes are so hard in books and movies, and they are so impactful because we can imagine it very vividly. I think when you see that, you see your child. I think that's why we have that reaction of, like, oh, I can't imagine that. It's not because you can't, it's because when you do imagine it, it's so incredibly horrifying and devastating that you can't let your mind stay there. You can't let your mind imagine it, even though most of us can and do. And that is not to say that I know what any other parent has gone through in losing a child. I think everybody's grief is particular to them, just like everybody's love is particular to them. Even if you've gone through the exact same thing, you can never know another person's grief because it's very personal. So maybe I don't know what that mother went through seeing her child die, but I think I can imagine what I would feel like in that situation. And I think that's why, like I said, I think that's why those scenes are so devastating, why they stay with us, why as a parent I want to generally avoid reading books that have things like that or movies that have things like that. because they are devastating and impactful, and obviously for these characters change the course of their lives. And that's something that he deals. It's a scene that's very brief and isn't dwelt on a lot, and yet you feel the weight of it through the rest of the story. You feel, in a removed sense, the impact that that's had on these characters for the rest of the book. But yeah, those are the two moments that I think are going to stay in my mind. But yeah, just there were a lot of like really quiet scenes too, just of friendship and relationship that were really special, because most books, they aren't the kind of relationships that most books explore and dwell on. Just the long-standing friendships between old men who've known each other for their whole lives. And it was really beautiful in that way. So yeah, a very slow read, but worth it. I want to read all the others. And there were things in the book that I didn't like, some moments that I didn't care for, but like, of course there are going to be, because he's thinking back on his life in its entirety, and no life is going to be without those moments. And yeah, ultimately a very worthwhile read, and would definitely recommend, especially to anybody who enjoys poetry. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.